Hey guys, in this video, we dive into how knights and the church worked together, how holy wars were framed, and why symbols like crosses and relics mattered so much. When we picture a medieval knight, most of us see a scene straight out of a coffee table, history book, a man in shining armor, visor up, a noble jawline catching the afternoon sun, his horse draped in a brightly colored caparison, and most importantly, big red cross stitched proudly onto his chest. He's the perfect blend of warrior and saint, protector of the weak, defender of the faith, the guy you'd want around if a dragon or a tax collector came knocking. It's a beautiful image. It's also, to put it bluntly, marketing. The medieval church and the knightly class at Blessed knew the value of a good story. They didn't just want fighters, they wanted fighters whose cause felt divinely approved. That cross on a knight's tunic wasn't just decorative, it was a brand, a signal, a promise that, in theory, his sword swung in the name of God. Not greed, but here's the uncomfortable truth. The line between those two motives was rarely clear. Knights didn't ride into battle humming hymns. They rode in for land, money, influence and, yes, sometimes genuine religious conviction. In other words, piety and ambition often shared the saddle. Now, that's not to say every knight was a cynical opportunist draped in borrowed holiness. Some really did see themselves as soldiers of Christ, convinced they were defending the moral order of the world. But even those true believers weren't operating in a vacuum. They lived in a system where faith was a political currency, and the church was the mint. Take, for example, the way oaths were framed. A knight's pledge to protect the church and defend the poor sounds noble on parchment. But in practice, protecting the church could mean putting down a rebellion against a bishop who'd raised taxes, or defending monastery lands from a rival lord. The poor, well, let's just say their safety sometimes depended on whether their village stood on land a knight's lord wanted to keep or take. This is where the myth starts to crack. Yes, knights prayed before battle. Yes, they wore relics into combat. But that doesn't mean religion was always the cause of their fight. Sometimes it was the excuse. It gave their wars the glow of righteousness, a sheen that made the blood easier to wash off at least in the court of public opinion. The church was no innocent bystander here. It actively cultivated the image of the knight as a holy warrior. Because it was useful, a church-aligned knight wasn't just a soldier. He was a tool of policy, a way to project both spiritual and military power. When you control the moral narrative, you control more than just the battlefield. You control hearts, minds, and the legitimacy of who gets to rule. One could argue that medieval propaganda was every bit as sophisticated as ours today. Sermons, songs, illuminated manuscripts, these were the medieval equivalent of social media campaigns. A knight marching under the papal banner didn't just inspire fear, he inspired belief. And belief, once secured, could justify almost anything. Of course, the Holy Knight brand also worked both ways. It wasn't just the church using knights. Knights used the church, too. Aligning yourself with a sacred cause was like having the best PR team in Europe. A victory wasn't just a military win, it was a sign of divine favor. Lose, and, well, maybe you'd sin, or maybe God was testing you. Either way, the church had a way of spinning it. This intertwining of piety and politics is what makes studying knights so tricky. It's tempting to slot them into clean categories, religious or worldly, noble or greedy. But the reality was messier. A knight could be deeply devout and utterly ruthless. A man who prayed fervently for God's guidance before torching a village. And in the logic of the age, there was no contradiction in that. When I first started digging into this topic, I kept running into the same problem. Primary sources don't always tell you why someone acted, only what they did, and those whys, what are often wrapped in a lot of holy language. A knight might claim he was riding to liberate Jerusalem, but was he also looking forward to the plunder, the prestige, and the land grants that came with a crusade? Almost certainly. So, if we want to understand how medieval knights used religion for power, we have to start by peeling back the shiny saintly armor of the myth. We need to look at how religion worked not just as a belief system, but as a political and economic tool, because in medieval Europe, faith wasn't just about you believed. It was about how you fought, who you served, and, often, what you could get in return. To understand why knights could wield religion as a weapon, sometimes literally, you have to picture the spiritual and political backdrop of the Middle Ages. Forget our modern separation of church and state. In medieval Europe, the church was the state in many ways, or at least it was stitched so tightly into the fabric of governance that pulling the two apart would have unraveled the whole system. Religion wasn't just Sunday morning business, it seeped into everything: law, education, medicine, marriage, warfare, even the calendar itself. The year was divided less by fiscal quarters and more by feast days and fasts. Villages were dotted with chapels, and cities with cathedrals that could swallow half the town square in shadow. Monks were copying manuscripts that would shape not just theology, but legal codes, diplomatic agreements, even agricultural practices. In this world, the church didn't have to convince people God existed. Belief was the default setting. The real power play was in defining what God wanted and, conveniently, that answer often aligned with the political goals of whoever was in charge. For knights, this was fertile ground. The religious climate made it possible for military campaigns to be framed as moral duties. When a bishop declared that defending a certain patch of land was God's will, the conversation wasn't just about borders, it was about salvation. And salvation, as every medieval Christian was taught from cradle to grave, was the ultimate prize. Now, the church wasn't a single, perfectly unified machine. It had factions, rivalries, and even competing popes, at times the 14th century Western schism being a prime example. But from the perspective of most ordinary people, the church spoke with a single divine voice. And that voice had the power to bless or curse, to legitimize or damn. Knights understood this instinctively. One thing we often forget is how much of medieval life was about visible signs. A knight's banner, a priest's vestments, a gilded reliquary holding the bone of a saint. These weren't just decoration, they were public statements of authority. Carrying a relic into battle wasn't just superstition. It was a way of telling your enemies and your allies that you were backed by heaven itself. And these symbols weren't just for the battlefield. In peacetime, a knight might fund the building of a church or donate land to a monastery. On paper, this looked like piety and, sometimes it was. But it was also a savvy move in the social chess game. A donation to a monastery could secure prayers for your soul and the loyalty of an influential abbot. It could also remind everyone in the region that you were a man of both power and godly virtue. There's also the rural factor to consider. The majority of the population were peasants living in small villages, and their contact with the wider world was minimal. For them, the local priest was not just a religious figure, but the main interpreter of truth itself. If the priest said a certain knight was defending the faith, that was usually accepted without question. After all, who was going to argue? The knight had the sword, and the priest had the keys to heaven. Of course, there were cracks in the system. Not everyone bought into every holy justification for war or politics. Chroniclers sometimes recorded skepticism quiet at first, louder in later centuries about whether God really wanted every battle that bore his name. But for much of the medieval period, religion remained the most powerful rallying cry you could attach to a cause. If you want a snapshot of this environment, imagine a medieval fair day. Merchants are hawking spices, cloth, and carved trinkets. Somewhere in the square, a priest is preaching about an upcoming crusade. He speaks of sin and redemption, of the duty to defend the faith. Beside him, a knight in polished mail listens, nodding solemnly. Later, that knight might speak to young men in the crowd, telling them that by joining his company, they can win not only glory, but eternal life. It's a sales pitch, but the currency isn't just coin, it's the promise of paradise. This was the ecosystem in which knights operated, a place where faith wasn't just personal belief, but a communal framework, reinforced daily by sights, sounds, and rituals. In such a world, using religion for power wasn't even always seen as was seen as natural. If God ruled over all creation, then of course he ruled over the battlefield too. By the time we move into the High Middle Ages, the stage is fully set for the church and knighthood to enter a kind of partnership. The church offers moral legitimacy. The knights offer armed enforcement, and somewhere in that handshake, the myth of the holy warrior takes root, a myth that will prove remarkably hard to kill. The early Middle Ages weren't exactly the glamorous backdrop of a chivalric romance. Picture less knight in shining armor and more armed guy on a horse working for whoever feeds him. That's essentially what knights started as: mounted warriors serving local lords, often with little in the way of formal training, no code of honor to speak of, and a job description that boiled down to protect my land and attack my enemies. In the chaos after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, power became high. Without strong central authority, landowners relied on personal armies, and mounted fighters were worth their weight in gold or, more accurately, in land grants. These early knights or proto-knights were skilled in combat but not yet wrapped in the velvet of chivalry and religious virtue. They were muscle for hire with a feudal twist. The church's first encounters with these warriors were complicated. On one hand, armed men could protect monastic lands from raiders. On the other, they could also be the raiders, and a monastery full of gold-plated chalices and silver candlesticks was as tempting a target as any rival castle. Many early knights had little hesitation about plundering church property if it suited them or their lord. By the 10th and 11th centuries, the church realized it couldn't simply wish these warriors away. So, in a move that was as political as it was spiritual, it tried to tame them. Enter the peace and truce of God movements. Starting in France, these church-led initiatives tried to limit violence by declaring certain days and places off for warfare: holy days, Sundays, and ideally church grounds. Knights were urged, sometimes under threat of excommunication, to protect clergy, peasants, and the poor. Did it work perfectly? Not even close. But it was a start, and more importantly, it reframed the knight's role. Instead of being a roving fighter with shifting loyalties, he was now being cast at least in theory, as a defender of the faith. The next big leap came with the First Crusade in 1095. Pope Urban II's call to arms was a masterstroke of religious marketing. Knights were told that by fighting for the liberation of Jerusalem, they could wipe away their sins and secure eternal salvation. It was like offering a get-out-hell-free card, and it resonated powerfully in a culture obsessed with the afterlife. Suddenly, being a knight wasn't just a job. It was a calling. Riding into battle with a cross sewn onto your surcoat wasn't only a show of loyalty. It was a declaration that your sword was an instrument of divine will. This shift wasn't purely spiritual, it was strategic. The church, Handy essentially recruited the most dangerous men in Europe and pointed them toward an external enemy. It's worth noting that the church's embrace of knighthood didn't erase its wariness. A knight might be holy in theory, but in practice he was still a man with weapons, ambitions, and a temper. That's why the church also pushed for the creation of knightly vows, chivalric codes, and religious orders like the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller. These orders were military by nature but bound by monastic discipline, at least in principle. But here's where the skepticism creeps in. The church wasn't just civilizing knights, it was also harnessing them. By wrapping warfare in religious justification, it gave knights a moral shield to go with their physical one. It turned personal feuds into holy wars and territorial grabs into defending Christendom, and for knights, that was a convenient narrative. Being seen as God's warrior made it a lot easier to collect taxes, recruit men, and keep rivals in check. If you want an example of how quickly this alliance could be abused, look at the Albigensian Crusade 1209-1229. Officially, it was a campaign to root out heresy in southern France. Unofficially, it was also a land grab that enriched northern lords and extended the French crown's influence. Religion gave the campaign legitimacy. Swords gave it teeth. By the end of the High Middle Ages, the image of the knight as a pious, Defender was firmly entrenched in the European imagination. Whether or not it matched reality was beside the point. The Church had successfully reframed a class of warriors as protectors of the faith, and knights had embraced the role out of belief, partly out of the undeniable perks that came with it. If medieval knighthood had a beating heart, it was the oath. You could own the best armor in Christendom, ride the fastest warhorse, and swing a sword like you were born with one in hand, but without an oath, you were just another armed thug. The oath gave knighthood its moral gloss, its supposed higher purpose. The ceremony was often wrapped in layers of religious symbolism. A young squire might spend the night before his dubbing in a chapel, fasting, praying, and keeping vigil over his weapons. Come morning, he'd kneel before his lord or a priest, swear loyalty, and receive a symbolic tap on the shoulder with a sword. The whole thing had the air of a sacrament, half military commissioning, half baptism into a new life. On paper, these oaths were sweeping in their nobility. Defend the church, protect the weak, uphold justice, be loyal to your lord. It's the kind of language that looks good carved into a stone archway. But, as with so many lofty promises, the devil was in the details, and medieval lords and knights were quite skilled at creative interpretation. Take defend the church. For instance, did that mean shielding monasteries from Viking raids? Sure, did it also sometimes mean marching against other Christians because the Pope declared them heretics? Absolutely. Protect the weak sounded wonderful, but weakness was a relative concept. Peasants, in your lord's territory, might enjoy your protection. Peasants, in your rival's territory, might find themselves burned out of house and home. The flexibility of these oaths wasn't a bug in the system. It was the feature that made them so useful. Knights could fulfill the letter of their promises while twisting the spirit to fit their lord's needs or their own. It's tempting to think of this as hypocrisy, but in the medieval mindset, it often wasn't. The oath wasn't a rigid contract in the modern legal sense. It was more like a declaration of alignment. If the church said a campaign was righteous, then fighting in it could be framed as fulfilling your vow no matter how much it resembled a land grab. Of course, there were moments when the tension between sacred promise and political expediency became painfully obvious. Chroniclers occasionally tell of knights torn between loyalty to their lord and loyalty to the church. In some cases, the church tried to tip the scales by offering spiritual incentives. Fight for us, and your sins will be forgiven. Break your oath to a heretic lord, and God will reward you. And let's not forget the very human side of swearing. An oath. These ceremonies were public theater. They weren't just about binding the knight to his duties, they were about sending a message to everyone watching. A lord who could line up a dozen armored men in his hall and have them all swear loyalty, under the gaze of the local clergy, was putting on a show of both martial strength and divine favor. The church also understood the propaganda value. Priests presiding over oaths could reinforce the idea that the knight's sword was an instrument of God's will. If that same knight later rode into battle under a papal banner, the oath became retroactive proof of his holy mission. But here's the twist. For all their ceremony and solemnity, oaths could be surprisingly fragile. Political alliances shifted. Lords fell out of favor. The Pope himself might change his stance on a conflict. Knights sometimes broke their vows outright, justifying the betrayal with a convenient new interpretation or a papal dispensation. One famous example comes from the 100 Years' War, when knights found themselves caught between competing loyalties to England, France, and the Church. In some cases, they switched sides more than once, each time claiming that their oath-bound duty had shifted with the true cause. Cynical, maybe. But in a world where survival often depended on choosing the winning side, it was also pragmatic. So, was the knightly oath sacred or strategic? The answer, frustratingly, is both. For some knights, the oath was a genuine moral compass. For others, it was a political tool, one that could be wielded as deftly as a sword. And for many, it was a little of each. Belief and ambition tangled so tightly together that even they might not have been able to tell them apart. In medieval Europe, a pilgrimage was a well-worn spiritual tradition. You'd travel often on foot to a sacred site, endure hardship along the way, and return spiritually renewed, and maybe with a few holy souvenirs. For most people, it was a deeply personal act of devotion. The church, however, eventually saw something bigger. What if you could take the fervor of pilgrimage, mix it with the muscle of the knightly class, and aim it at a political and military target? That's essentially what the Crusades were, weaponized pilgrimages. The turning point came in 1095, when Pope Urban II gave his famous speech at Clermont. He didn't just call on knights to take up arms, he wrapped the call in a dazzling offer: fight to reclaim Jerusalem and the Holy Land from Muslim control, and your sins will be forgiven. To medieval ears, this was extraordinary. The afterlife was a constant concern, and here was a way to secure a place in heaven and gain glory on earth. Urban's message hit like a lightning strike. Pilgrimage had always been about personal salvation. Now it was tied directly to warfare. The trip was no longer just a walk to a shrine, it was a march to battle. The roads to the east filled with armed men, their banners stitched with crosses, their minds full of both holy purpose and the very real prospect of loot and land. The First Crusade's success in capturing Jerusalem in 1099 only cemented the idea that God smiled upon this new kind of warfare. Chroniclers spun the victory as a miracle. Bloodshed was recast as righteous purification. From then on, the crusading model could be adapted to almost any conflict the Church wanted to frame as holy. Whether or not it had anything to do with Jerusalem, that's where the power play became obvious. Crusades weren't just launched against non-Christians, they were declared against fellow Christians deemed heretical. The Albigensian Crusade in southern France 1209–1229 targeted the Cathars, a Christian sect whose beliefs threatened the Church's authority. To the knights who took part, it was officially a holy war. In practice, it was also a chance to seize rich lands and expand influence under papal blessing. From the knight's perspective, joining a crusade could be a career move. Successful campaigns brought wealth, titles, and the kind of prestige that made enemies think twice. And even if you died, you had the promise of eternal rewarder, comfort in a world where battlefield mortality was high. But not all crusades went smoothly, and the religious gloss didn't always hold up under scrutiny. The Fourth Crusade, 1202–1204, was meant to retake Jerusalem but ended up sacking Constantinople, a Christian city. The justifications for this detour were creative, to say the least, and not everyone bought them. Even at the time, there were voices within the Church questioning whether God had really sanctioned the slaughter of fellow Christians for the sake of settling debts and political grudges. Still, the idea of holy war proved stubbornly resilient. It was too useful to abandon. For the Church, it was a way to direct the violent energies of Europe's warrior class outward, rather than letting them tear apart the continent from within. For knights, it was a way to legitimize violence, cloak ambition in sanctity, and sometimes return home richer than they'd ever dreamed. The symbolism of the Crusader knight became deeply embedded in European culture. Songs, poems, and illuminated manuscripts depicted them as saints in armor, riding eastward beneath blazing crosses. The reality, mud, hunger, disease, backroom deals, was much messier, but the myth endured because it served both church and knightly interests. One could argue that the Crusades were the ultimate expression of how religion could be harnessed for power in the medieval world. They combined faith, politics, and economics into a single unstoppable narrative. And once you accepted that killing in God's name was not only permissible but praiseworthy, the moral floodgates were open. For the knights who marched, whether they believed wholeheartedly in the cause, or saw it mainly as an opportunity, the result was the same. Their swords carried the weight of divine sanction, and in a time when the Church's word could outweigh any earthly law, that was the most potent kind of power there was. If the Crusades were the Church's grand experiment in holy war, then the military monastic orders were the long-term institutions that grew out of it, part monastery, part army, part bank, part political machine. They're also one of the clearest examples of how religion and power could be fused into something almost unstoppable. The most famous of these were the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, with the Teutonic Knights making their mark in Northern Europe. On the surface, these men had taken vows like monks: poverty, chastity, obedience. They lived in communal quarters, prayed at set hours, and wore simple habits, except their simple habits often came with chainmail underneath and swords strapped to their belts. The Templars, founded around 1119, began with a straightforward mission: protect Christian pilgrims traveling to and from the Holy Land. But their success and the immense trust placed in them by both secular rulers and the Church quickly expanded their role. They became elite warriors, shock troops for the Crusades, and, in time, financial powerhouses who managed vast estates and even acted as proto-bankers for kings. It's easy to romanticize them. And indeed, medieval propaganda did exactly that. Templars were painted as the purest form of the knightly ideal: disciplined, devout, utterly committed to the cause of Christendom. Their white mantles with the red cross became iconic, a walking advertisement for the merging of martial skill and religious piety. But like any powerful institution, their motives weren't always so saintly. Controlling fortified castles along key trade and travel routes meant controlling wealth. Managing donations of land and treasure from nobles eager to buy heavenly favor meant amassing economic influence on a scale most lords could only dream of. And because they answered directly to the Pope, they often operated outside local political constraints, making them both incredibly valuable allies and dangerous rivals. The Hospitallers followed a slightly different path. Founded earlier as a charitable group to care for sick and injured pilgrims, they evolved into a formidable fighting force. Their dual role running hospitals while also fielding heavily armed knights gave them a public image of compassion wrapped in steel. They could be tending to a wounded traveler one day and leading a cavalry charge the next. In Northern Europe, the Teutonic Knights took the same model and turned it toward expansion in the Baltic. Officially, they were there to convert pagans to Christianity. Unofficially, they were building a theocratic state, carving out territories that would remain under their control for centuries. Religion provided the justification. The sword enforced it. What's striking about these orders is how seamlessly they blended genuine religious devotion with cold strategic thinking. Members often truly believed they were serving God's will, but they also engaged in diplomacy, resource management, and political maneuvering that would put any medieval court to shame. The line between defending the faith and expanding the order's influence was paper-thin. The Church, for its part, saw them as indispensable. Here were disciplined, loyal fighters who could be deployed without having to wrangle with the messy feudal obligations of regular knights. In return, the orders received privileges that insulated them from local interference: exemptions from taxes, the right to collect tithes, their own legal jurisdictions. It was a mutually beneficial arrangement, at least, until those privileges became threatening. The Templars' eventual downfall in the early 14th century is a case study in what happens when religious military power grows too large. King Philip IV of France, deeply in debt to the order, accused them of heresy, idolatry, and other lurid crimes. The charges were almost certainly fabricated, but with the Pope's cooperation, the Templars were dissolved, their leaders executed, and their wealth seized. It's a reminder that in medieval politics, God's will could be conveniently reinterpreted when someone's power needed trimming. Still, for nearly 2 centuries, the military orders embodied the most potent fusion of piety and force in the medieval world. They weren't just symbols. They were proof of concept that religion could be institutionalized into a fighting machine, and their legacy equal parts awe and suspicion would shape the way future generations thought about the relationship between faith and military power. In the medieval world, appearances mattered. Not just for vanity's sake, but because the visual language of power was a form of communication. Everyone understood then, the illiterate peasants in the fields. For knights, their armor, banners, crosses, and sacred relics weren't mere accessories. They were powerful symbols that broadcast authority, legitimacy, and divine favor. Think about the iconic image of a knight clad in gleaming chainmail, a surcoat emblazoned with a cross, helmet crested with feathers or horns. That wasn't just for show, it sent a clear message. This man was a warrior chosen by God, fighting not just for land or lord, but for a sacred cause. The cross, especially, was central. It was stitched onto shields, sewn onto surcoats, painted on banners. When a knight displayed the cross, he aligned himself with the church's mission. It was a visual shorthand for, "I am protected by God, and I carry His authority." This was more than superstition. In an era where divine blessing was believed to have tangible effects, displaying the cross could boost morale among allies and intimidate foes, who might hesitate to strike a holy warrior. Armor itself carried symbolism beyond mere protection. The gleam of polished steel wasn't just practical, it was meant to dazzle in sunlight, marking the knight as an elite figure. Helmets and shields were often decorated with family crests or religious iconography, linking the wearer to a noble lineage and sacred duty. These symbols tied personal identity to a larger narrative of faith and honor. Relics took this symbolism to another level. These were objects believed to be connected to saints or Christ himself. Bones, fragments of the true cross, pieces of cloth. Carrying a relic into battle wasn't just a ritual, it was a claim that divine power was literally on your side. Some knights kept tiny reliquaries hidden inside their armor, close to the heart. Others participated in elaborate ceremonies blessing these relics before battle. Of course, the efficacy of relics was a matter of belief, and skepticism existed even in medieval times. Some saw the trade in relics as exploitative, a way for the church and wealthy knights to profit from popular piety. But regardless of the truth, the cultural impact was undeniable. Relics could rally troops, provide psychological comfort, and strengthen the narrative that their cause was just. Banners and standards were another key piece of this symbolic puzzle. They weren't just colorful flags fluttering in the wind. Losing your banner in battle was a disgrace. It was like losing your identity. Protecting it was paramount, and capturing an enemy's banner was a major victory, a sign you'd broken their spirit. The visual language here reinforced who was right in the eyes of God and men. Even the knight's very posture and ritual mattered. The act of kneeling to receive knighthood, the way a sword was presented and accepted, the prayers said before battle, all were laden with religious significance. These moments weren't just formalities. They were performances that reinforced the intertwining of sacred and martial roles. When you put all these elements together, it's clear that knights weren't just warriors, they were walking, fighting icons. Their whole appearance was a form of communication designed to legitimize their actions and intimidate opposition. And because these symbols were so deeply woven into the medieval worldview, they shaped how people understood power itself. In short, the armor and crosses were less about individual glory and more about signaling a broader, divinely sanctioned order. To challenge a knight was, in a way, to challenge God's authority as it was understood in that time and place in medieval Europe. The relationship between knights and the church was hardly one-sided. Beyond the battlefield, the church wielded immense influence through patronage, and knights often found themselves both beneficiaries and tools of this intricate power web. When a knight donated land, money, or funded the building of a chapel or monastery, it wasn't just an act of faith. It was a strategic investment. These acts secured not only prayers for the donor's soul, but also political goodwill. Monasteries and churches served as centers of local authority, often mediating disputes, maintaining records, and influencing peasants' loyalties. Supporting them meant strengthening one's own position in a tangled feudal landscape. Take the example of a knight named Sir Geoffrey, a fictional composite, but typical of his time. He might grant a parcel of his estate to a nearby abbey, hoping the monks would pray for his family's salvation and, perhaps more immediately, keep an eye on rebellious peasants or rivals. The abbey could also serve as a political ally, providing both spiritual endorsement and practical support. This was a time when religion was deeply intertwined with everyday life. The church's blessing was more than symbolic. It was often necessary for legitimacy. Kings, nobles, and knights alike understood that a ruler's power wasn't secure without the church's approval. That meant knights who could demonstrate close ties to religious institutions gained a leg up in the competition for status and influence. At the same time, the church had its own agenda. Patronage was a means of expanding its reach. Receiving lands or gifts from knights increased the church's wealth and influence, often shifting local power balances. Powerful monasteries could rival lords in terms of territory and resources. This wasn't without conflict. Disputes over rights and authority were common, but the mutual benefits kept the relationship alive. Some knights even sought ecclesiastical positions or married into clerical families to further cement their influence. The line between secular and religious power was blurry, making patronage a vital tool for navigating the medieval political maze. Moreover, the church could call on its network to enforce discipline. Excommunication, cutting someone off from the sacraments and community, was a serious threat. A knight who fell out of favor risked social and political isolation, which could be devastating. This spiritual sanction became a lever the church used to keep knights in line or bend them to its will. Consider the case of a knight who defied a bishop's authority or attacked church property. Even a powerful warrior could face interdicts or excommunication, stripping him of honor and undermining his alliances. In a world where reputation was everything, losing the church's favor could mean losing everything. But the relationship wasn't always smooth. Some knights resented the church's meddling or its attempts to control secular matters. Conflicts flared, sometimes erupting into outright violence. Yet, even in those moments, religion remained central to the story, each side claiming divine justification. So, patronage was more than just charity or devotion. It was a political chess game with high stakes. Knights gave to the church to gain influence and legitimacy, while the church accepted those gifts to strengthen its temporal power. This delicate dance shaped medieval society in profound ways, making religion a crucial tool in the pursuit of power.